Every year when Halloween comes around, I usually go trick-or-treating around the neighborhood with my friends Ben and Harrison. But back then, we were still young, and our parents would usually come along with us. Since our houses were very close to each other, we had been close friends from a young age. And Ben and Harrison's parents were also very close with mine. We were good neighbors to each other. But this year, we were 13 years old, so it was the first year we went trick-or-treating without any parents accompanying us. Naturally, we were very excited to run around the neighborhood, collect candy, and simply have fun. Every year before Halloween, we would carefully plan out our trick-or-treat route. We would always aim for the biggest houses we could find, because those were the places where we could get full-size chocolate bars. At the end of last year, there was a luxurious and upscale street under construction, and finally this year it was completed. All the people who bought homes there had moved in. So this year we planned to go to that neighborhood first, and then move on to other places afterward. This new row of houses was located right at the beginning of the street, only about a 10-minute walk away. So, at exactly 8 p.m., after my family had finished dinner, Ben and Harrison arrived at my house, and we began our trick-or-treat adventure. We first stopped by the houses around my place, because they were all our very friendly neighbors. And after that, we crossed the street to head over to the new neighborhood. After about 10 minutes of walking, we finally arrived at the new row of houses. To our surprise, we didn't see any kids trick-or-treating in the area. Even though the houses were all beautifully decorated for Halloween, we figured that the kids in this neighborhood hadn't been allowed out yet, and that made us even more excited, so we quickly ran to the first house. The large door gradually opened, and a kind elderly man greeted us with a warm smile and handed each of us a full-size Snickers bar.
Happy Halloween, kids!
As we left the driveway, we were all extremely excited because of the smooth start. But when we got to the next few houses, none of them opened their doors. After about 10 houses with no one answering, we began to feel like we were wasting our Halloween here without getting anything. And we thought maybe the people living here were celebrating the holiday somewhere else. But there was still one last hope for us on this street. The biggest house in the neighborhood, located at the very end of the road. We decided to head there and give it one last try before moving on to another area. This house was truly massive, looking almost like a palace. It was extravagant and grand. That only made us even more excited, thinking they would give us big chocolate bars. As we climbed the stairs to the house, I didn't see anyone, which gave us the feeling that the owners of this house might also be out, and we would be wasting our time going up to yet another house without any candy. Still, we went up to the porch, and I rang the doorbell. Immediately, an elderly woman opened the door and greeted us. Both of them smiled as we said, "Trick or treat," and the woman opened the door wider, revealing a large round table set up in their spacious living room. On the table, there were nearly all types of high-end candy and chocolate that you could find in stores. This was truly a dream come true for us. It was the first time I had ever met someone who spent so much money for Halloween. But looking at their house, I guess it made sense. She told us to come in and choose 2 types of candy or chocolate that we liked. Without hesitation, we all ran inside, marveling at all the different kinds of candy and chocolate they had displayed on the table. We were all so excited at that moment to be able to choose almost anything we wanted. But just as I was debating between a hammer candy or an extra chocolate bar, suddenly I heard the door slam shut. We all turned around, and the woman was still standing there. She then told us to stay a little while longer, because she had a special gift for us. At that moment, both Ben and I were extremely scared and worried, but Harrison wasn't. He was excited about the special gift. I honestly didn't understand what he was thinking. Ben and I gradually backed towards the door, ready to run, while Harrison still sat there. The sound of her footsteps grew louder. I immediately opened the door and ran outside, and Harrison, confused, followed us. I could hear the woman's frantic screams, calling us to come back. At that point, the main door of the house had already been locked by her. We quickly ran to her backyard. I could clearly hear her footsteps and voice right behind us. We hid in a nearby bush, waiting for her to pass, then quickly climbed over the wall and escaped from that place. We kept running until we finally made it back to my house. The three of us sat in front of the garage, panting heavily. Ben suggested that we should tell our parents about what happened, but I was certain that if I told them, they would scold me because they had warned me not to enter strangers' houses. So, we decided to stay quiet and keep the whole thing a secret. After a while, we became more cautious, no longer daring to go trick-or-treating with just a few people. We gathered a few other kids who were also out trick-or-treating, and we all went together around my neighborhood. That was definitely the scariest thing that had ever happened to me on Halloween. And to this day, Ben and Harrison still talk about it every year during Halloween. I still don't know what the special gift the woman had prepared for us was, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened to us if she had caught us while we were running. It was an unforgettable experience. Halloween has always been a time for me and my dad to embark on exciting adventures. Unlike other kids who are busy trick-or-treating or dressing up as spooky characters, my dad and I usually choose a different path, one that's more adventurous, exploring, abandoned, old places that no one seems to dare to visit. This year, my dad heard about an abandoned house deep in the forest, and as soon as he suggested exploring it on Halloween night, I couldn't say no. The house was located far from town, on a secluded road that led into the woods. My dad drove slowly along the winding roads, where even the streetlights barely illuminated anything. The only light came from our car's headlights, casting a glow on the dark trees lining the road. I looked out the window, feeling the cold autumn air seep into my skin. A sense of eeriness began to spread, but with my dad, I always felt safe. He was the only person who could make me feel secure on such adventurous trips. As we got closer to the abandoned house, I couldn't help but feel the atmosphere around us growing darker. The trees surrounding the house grew wild and thick, as if they were trying to swallow the house into the forest's shadows. Gentle breezes blew through, making the branches creak, creating a spooky sound like the signs of a forgotten past. We arrived just as night had fully fallen. The house loomed before us, tall and dilapidated. The walls were peeling, with patches of old red paint still clinging in spots to the brick underneath. Broken windows glistened in the moonlight, and part of the roof had collapsed, making the house look even more frightening. But that's exactly why my dad and I loved places like this. They were full of mystery, and you never knew what you might find. We turned off the car engine and stepped out, flashlights in hand. My dad smiled at me, encouraging, ready. This time we might find something interesting. I nodded, excited despite feeling a little nervous. The two of us began walking toward the house, making our way through the path that was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The front door was no longer there, leaving a gaping entrance, like a deep, dark hole waiting for us to step inside. Inside the house, the cold and musty air hit my nose, making me shiver. The old wooden floor was rotting, with boards that could easily collapse at any moment. Every step echoed with creaking sounds beneath our feet. Shattered glass was scattered everywhere, and I had to carefully step around it, afraid that one small misstep might cause injury. In the dim light of our flashlights, everything appeared faint and shadowy, as if the house had been sleeping for decades. On the walls, the remnants of old, peeling wallpaper showed faint traces of the life that once existed in this place. We explored room by room, finding fragments of a long-gone life-old furniture, books eaten away by termites, and small items that the house's former residents likely left behind when they departed. I could almost imagine the echoes of laughter from the family that once lived here, now nothing more than forgotten pieces of memories. When we entered the living room, my dad's flashlight shone into a dark corner. I saw something in the corner that made me shiver. It was an old doll, probably from decades ago, lying still on an old rocking chair. It was wearing a white dress that had turned yellow with age, its large round eyes staring blankly ahead. Its hair was frizzy and tangled, and its entire body was covered in dust. My dad noticed what I was looking at, glanced over, and laughed. "It's just an old doll, probably from some child who used to live here." He walked closer to the doll, looking at it curiously. "Actually, it's in pretty good shape compared to the other things here." I forced a laugh, trying to act casual, but a growing sense of unease began to settle in. There was something about this doll that I couldn't take my eyes off of. Those big eyes seemed to follow our every movement, even though the doll didn't budge. We continued to explore the other rooms, but the whole time, I felt as though the doll's eyes were watching me. We moved on to the rest of the house, but there was nothing particularly special, just the remnants of a time long past. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, and the doll's eyes continued to haunt me. I looked back several times, and each time, I had the feeling that the doll's eyes had shifted, as if it was watching me from afar. As we were about to leave the house, I couldn't resist looking back at the doll one last time. My heart pounded when I noticed something strange. Its eyes were no longer staring blankly as before. Now, they were looking straight at me. Its previously expressionless eyebrows were now furrowed, giving it a menacing look. The faint smile it had earlier was gone, replaced by an empty, haunting expression. I jumped, feeling a chill down my spine. I thought about telling my dad, but hesitated. Would he believe me? Or would he think I was just imagining things? I didn't want to worry him, and I certainly didn't want him to stop taking me on these adventures. So, I stayed quiet and followed him out of the house, but the image of the doll kept lingering in my mind. After we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about that doll. The image of those eyes and that terrifying smile haunted me in my sleep, making it impossible to get any rest. I kept wondering whether what I saw was real or just a figment of my imagination. A few days later, my dad decided to return to the house with my older brother to take some photos. He liked capturing the places we had visited, and this abandoned house was the perfect addition to his collection of creepy photos. When he returned, he eagerly showed me the pictures he had taken. I grabbed the camera and flipped through each one, trying to find the image of the doll. But strangely, there wasn't a single picture of the doll. The rocking chair was still there, but it was empty, with no trace of the doll I had seen before. I asked my dad about the doll, but he just shrugged. I didn't see any doll. Maybe someone took it. I didn't know how to explain this. Was the doll even real? If it was, why had it disappeared so mysteriously? These questions kept swirling in my mind, but there were no answers. That Halloween night left me with a deep sense of unease about what could happen in abandoned places. And since then, I've never looked at an old doll the same way again. The questions about that doll will remain forever unanswered, and I never returned to that house again. It was around September when I was looking for a temporary job to earn some extra income. I applied to amusement parks and shopping malls, thinking that those jobs would suit me because I enjoyed having fun at work. Finally, by mid-October, I landed a temporary job at a Halloween store in a shopping mall. This store only opened once a year during the Halloween season and closed immediately afterward. The store wasn't anything special, but it was filled with creepy costumes, scary decorations, and animated monsters. For me, it was an easy way to make some pocket money while still in high school. I attended school in the morning, took some time to rest in the afternoon, and worked the night shift from 5 p.m. until the store closed. Usually, that would be around 10 p.m. Most of the time, the store was pretty quiet and boring. I would usually sit at the cash register with my co-worker, Megan, chatting and scrolling through our phones when there were no customers. The customers were typically families looking for costumes for their kids or groups of teenagers buying masks. But one night, things got strange in a way I had never experienced before. It was around 9 p.m., and that night Megan had called in sick, so I was the only one working in the store. It was Halloween, so the store was packed with customers, and we were going to stay open an hour later than usual. After the customers slowly trickled out, I finally got a bit of time to rest after having to do all the work by myself, covering for Megan. I sat at the cash register, listening to the store's background music and occasionally hearing the buzzing from the fluorescent lights on the ceiling. Every now and then, the animated monsters outside the store would make noises when someone walked by or touched them. At that point, the other stores in the mall were also starting to close, and the mall was becoming quieter. I felt a bit bored, so I took the opportunity to scroll through my phone to pass the time until closing. As I absent-mindedly skimmed through social media posts, the sound of the door chime suddenly rang, signaling that a customer had just entered the store. I looked up and immediately noticed that the person who entered was unlike the usual customers. It was a tall, thin man wearing a long, worn-out black coat. A black fedora was pulled low, obscuring most of his face. He glided into the store with a calm demeanor, but there was something about him that made me feel uneasy. The man silently walked down the aisles of the store without saying a word. He stopped in front of the strange costumes, the hollow-eyed masks, and the fake skeletons that rattled whenever someone touched them. I didn't dare look directly at him, but my eyes unintentionally followed his every step. Each time he moved past the racks, I had the sensation that the atmosphere in the store became more stifling, as if his presence was suffocating the space around him. After a few minutes, the man approached the checkout counter. He placed a simple, glossy black mask on the counter, its hollow eyes devoid of any expression. I glanced up at his face, hidden beneath the black hat, and tried to smile politely, though I felt a tinge of nervousness inside.
"How much for this mask?"
he asked, his voice deep and raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. I picked up the mask to check the price. "This one is $15, sir," I replied, my hands trembling as I tapped into the cash register. He stood still, staring at me from beneath the brim of his hat, his gaze cold as ice. The atmosphere became strangely tense.
"Do you like Halloween?"
he asked, his deep voice calm, yet it felt like he was testing me. I was a bit startled by the unrelated question, but still tried to answer. "Yes, I do. I love Halloween because people get to dress up and enjoy the festive atmosphere," I replied with a nervous smile. The man kept his unblinking gaze on me, his voice soft but commanding.
"Do you know? Halloween isn't just about costumes and candy. Sometimes it's about what we don't see. Have you ever thought that the things we think are costumes might not really be costumes at all?"
My heart began to race. I didn't fully understand what he was implying, but the air in the store felt suffocating and terrifying. I glanced around the store as if searching for some invisible help, but there was no one. The man pulled $15 out of his coat pocket, and I quickly completed the transaction, handing him the mask. "Thank you for your purchase." "Have a great Halloween night," I said. He took the mask, but before leaving, he leaned down close to the counter. I could smell a foul odor emanating from his worn-out coat. He whispered, almost just loud enough for me to hear,
"Be careful. Some things here are not just decorations."
His words sent a chill down my spine. I stood frozen as he walked out of the store. The door closed behind him, but I couldn't move. All of my senses seemed paralyzed, my body unable to react. It was now 11 o'clock, time to close the store. I went around checking the store one last time before ending my shift. His words echoed in my mind, making it impossible to look at the store items the same way. A few minutes later, I finished the check and headed back to the register, planning to write a note about the strange man I had just encountered. But when I looked down at the counter, my heart nearly stopped. The glossy black mask he had bought was still there, untouched, never taken. Panic surged through me as I rushed to the door to see if he was still there. But the parking lot was empty, with only the faint silhouettes of a few night shift security guards in the distance. There was no sign of anyone else, no trace that he had ever left. I returned inside and picked up the mask. When I flipped it over, I saw a small, scribbled message inside, written in black ink. "Be careful. Some things here are not just decorations." I dropped the mask in shock, fear engulfing my body. It felt like I had just witnessed something that didn't belong in this world. I looked around the store, the flickering lights from the fluorescent bulbs on the ceiling casting eerie shadows across the room. At that moment, I heard a noise. The buzzing sound from the store's sound system suddenly stopped, and for a brief second, I swear I saw a shadow pass by, gliding past the front glass window. The shape looked exactly like the man who had entered the store earlier, but it was just a fleeting shadow that disappeared in a matter of seconds, too unclear to identify. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do next. Suddenly, I heard a sound footsteps coming from the storage room. It was clear that I was the only one working that day, so no one else should be back there. The strange man's words from earlier suddenly flooded back into my mind, and a wave of fear spread through me, consuming all my thoughts. The footsteps grew louder, as if they were coming closer. I hurriedly flipped off the breaker and locked the door, rushing out of the store without daring to look back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the man and his warning replayed in my mind over and over. And since that night, I've always wondered were the things I saw and heard real, or was it just an illusion on a mysterious Halloween night? But one thing I knew for sure, I could never forget the feeling of his cold eyes staring right through me, as if he knew more than anyone about the things I couldn't see. That very night, I texted my manager and quit the Halloween store. It was a terrifying and haunting experience, but now looking back, it was kind of thrilling too. Last Halloween, my family decided to do something more special than usual. A trip to one of the most haunted locations in the US, the Crescent Hotel, located in the historic town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. This hotel has a long, eerie history, built in the late 19th century, with numerous ghostly legends attached to it. It was once a hospital and a fraudulent cancer treatment center run by a shady doctor, where dozens of people tragically passed away. Many claim that the spirits of these unfortunate patients and others who once lived in the hotel still linger there, haunting the halls. My family has always been fascinated by ghost stories, and have always been especially drawn to anything supernatural. My parents even organized a small Halloween party at the hotel with some friends and relatives. However, instead of enjoying the party, I was tasked with taking care of my 80-year-old cousin, Dylan, who was super excited about trick-or-treating. At 16, I wasn't as interested in going door to door for candy anymore, but I still loved the spooky atmosphere of Halloween. Eureka Springs is a small, peaceful town steeped in history. The cobblestone streets, old-fashioned houses with wooden shutters, and brightly lit street lamps made it the perfect setting for Halloween. As night fell, the entire town seemed to take on a ghostly atmosphere. The glow of flickering jack-o'-lanterns, the rustling of dry leaves, and the sound of distant laughter created an unsettling yet exciting mood that set the tone for the evening. As soon as the family party kicked off, Dylan and I left the Crescent Hotel and ventured out into the surrounding neighborhood for trick-or-treating. The houses in the area were large, with red brick walls and old-style roofs. Many were decorated with incredible detail: glowing jack-o'-lanterns, giant witch statues, and mannequins dressed as ghosts that hung eerily from the trees. I couldn't help but feel like this Halloween had a special air of magic and mystery. Dylan, in his wizard costume, was filled with energy, running from house to house with excitement, collecting as much candy as possible. I followed from a safe distance, keeping an eye on him but allowing him the freedom to enjoy himself. As Dylan approached each house, I stood back, admiring the surrounding homes and the quiet, spooky vibe that deepened as we walked further into the neighborhood. The busier streets near the hotel faded away, leaving us in a more isolated part of town. After about an hour, Dylan's candy bag was filled to the brim, but he still wasn't ready to call it a night. He kept asking to visit just a few more houses. By that point, the cold had started to get to me, and I was ready to head back to the warmth of the hotel, but Dylan was persistent. I finally gave in, although I told him it would be the last house. "This is the final one," I warned, and Dylan quickly agreed, excitement renewed. While Dylan darted off to the next house, I was momentarily distracted by a grand house down the street, elaborately decorated with twinkling lights, massive ghostly figures, and bright lampposts that illuminated the entire block. I stood in awe, completely mesmerized by the decorations, and for a few minutes, I forgot all about Dylan. When I turned back, Dylan was gone. My heart raced. I scanned the area but saw no sign of him. Panic set in, and I quickly walked down the street, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Just then, the sharp screeching of tires filled the air, followed by a terrified scream coming from a distance. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the sound, my heart pounding as fear gripped me. When I arrived, Dylan was nowhere in sight. A black car sped away down the road, its tires screeching as it rounded the corner. Panic washed over me as I frantically called out Dylan's name, searching everywhere for him. I was completely overwhelmed with fear until an elderly man sitting on his porch nearby noticed my distress. He rushed over, asking, "Where's the boy?" When I couldn't respond from shock, he continued, "I saw a man trying to force him into a car, but the boy screamed and kicked at him. The man panicked and drove off. I think the boy ran away." Tears of relief welled up in my eyes as I heard a rustling sound from behind a nearby bush. I rushed over to find Dylan, trembling and curled up behind the bush, terrified. I hugged him tightly, feeling as if I had just escaped a nightmare. The elderly man immediately called the police and urged us to stay with him until they arrived, not wanting us to walk back alone while the kidnapper might still be nearby. The police arrived within minutes and took our statements. Dylan, still shaken, recounted how the man had tried to pull him into the car, but he had screamed and kicked until the man fled. The officers assured us they would investigate the matter and escorted us back to the Crescent Hotel. When we returned, my family was already in a panic. My parents were beside themselves with worry, and we had to explain the entire ordeal to them and the police. The officers helped file a report and promised to find the kidnapper. That Halloween night, the ghost stories and haunted legends of the Crescent Hotel no longer seemed frightening to me. The reality of Dylan almost being kidnapped made me realize that the true monsters aren't ghosts or spirits, but the people with bad intentions lurking in the shadows. It was the most terrifying experience I've ever gone through, and since then, I've been much more cautious when walking at night, especially during festivals like Halloween. While the thrill of the supernatural can be exciting, I realize that the real dangers often come from living, breathing people, not the ghost stories we grow up hearing.